Hey guys, it's Brandon. I thought it would be fun to take a look at Nakamura's Blitz games from the recent World Blitz Championship, which was held in Dubai a few weeks ago. So people like King's Crusher and I think maybe somebody else has covered all of Magnus's games already, but I thought it would be fun to take a look at Nakamura. Nakamura finished third in this event, with Magnus winning the event with 17 points out of 21, and both Nakamura and Nepomniachtchi scored 16 out of 21, but I guess Nepomniachtchi had a better tiebreak score, so he came in second, and Nakamura came in third. But Nakamura is always fun to watch, and he plays online a lot, and so I thought it would be cool to just take a look at his games. I'll try to do every game. This is going to be part one of the video, where I'll do the first 10 games, and then the next 11 I'll do tomorrow or the next day. So this is part one of Nakamura at the World Blitz Championship. So, all right, let's get to it. I'm not going to go too deep into any variations or anything. I'll just try to go through the games, and point out some major things and maybe some major blunders in each game. Because these games are all 3 minutes with 2-second increments, and it would just be this doesn't have to be a 4-hour video. So we'll just try to have some fun here looking at these games. So this is the first game: Hikaru Nakamura versus Alexander Goloshchapov, Grandmaster, rated 2586 FIDE, and Naka with the white pieces. So he opens with e4. And Goloshchapov goes for the French defense, but Naka doesn't want any of that. He goes for sort of this King's Indian attack sort of setup, where if Black plays here d5, the idea is to play knight d2, and then if takes, there's no queen trade, and just sort of go for this King's Indian attack sort of setup. This is often sort of what Nakamura does against lower rated players. In Blitz, he tries to just sort of play some weird stuff, try to get out of book theory, and just relies on his ability to outplay people in quick time situations. So here we got a sort of a transition to a Sicilian. So we're going to sort of go into a closed Sicilian. It's still sort of a similar attack, as similar to maybe, or could have been, a King's Indian attack if Naka really wanted to. But he goes for f4, so picking up some space in the center, and Black decides to fianchetto the bishop. So we're just getting some development here, pretty standard. Usually the knight likes to come in here to d7, to e7, where it has control possibly over the f5 square. So we have now the knight coming into d7, and just some development here. And we'll just sort of go through these moves sort of quickly. Black decides to double fianchetto. And Naka slides this bishop back to f2, just so the queen can maybe have some open file, protecting the e pawn, maybe helping to prepare e5 in the future. Meanwhile, the bishop is still covering the d4 square, so the d4 push might be something in the future. Okay, we get some development, and now Black finally strikes out in the center here with f5. Probably a good idea. I mean, you can't just let White have this nice control of the center forever. So let's see what happens. Naka just ignores it, and plans probably to recapture with the pawn if Black ever initiates the capture, which he doesn't, just moving the rook opposite the queen, and Naka decides to move forward in the center with d4 here. So big center control for Naka at the moment. So let's see how this shakes out. Decides to capture, and now capture on e4 with the f pawn. And now sort of we see the structural transformation where Black has these two hanging pawns, and White has this isolated queen's pawn position. But at the moment, all the pieces are still on the board, and this pawn on d4 and f4 are giving White a lot more space. So White's probably better in this position, although Black does have the f5 square now for the knight to jump into, which he does, putting pressure on the d4 pawn. Which is a weakness for White, of course, but also guarding one of his own weaknesses here on d6. So Naka just defends the piece. He's got the knight, bishop, and rook defending the pawn. And here, black decided to go for this structural change, d5. I'm not sure about this change in the position. It helps get some space. The d6 square is available now, maybe for a knight to come in here and come into e4 at some point. Of course, it chases the white knight off of this d4 square and shuts out maybe this bishop along this diagonal. But on the other hand, it creates a weakness here on d6, and you're giving up the e5 square permanently, as well as shutting out your own bishop. So there are some pluses and minuses to both of this. Here, Naka chose to play knight c3. I thought knight g5 was an interesting move also. Just putting pressure on this weakness, trying to gang up on the weak pawn there. It's not really. It's sort of difficult to sort of go into this capture right away because of the pin on the queen. So maybe Naka wasn't really interested in getting into that kind of stuff. With the engine, I checked it, and the engine seems to think that knight g5 is fine. Excuse me, I'm just trying to get rid of some of these arrows here. Yikes. Okay, this is not working. Okay, just a second here. Okay, why is it doing this? There we go. Okay. So, Naka actually chose to go with a knight to c3 there. King h8. Just a safety move, putting the king in the corner. Queen d2. And now, this move struck me maybe as a little bit of a waiting move. I mean, it does cover some of these squares that the knight might want to jump to, but I can't imagine a situation where even if the knight comes to g5, black would really want to take that knight because his dark squares would be very, very weak. Yeah, but maybe g5 was at some point an idea, so Naka just decides, okay, let's play h4, clamp down on some kingside stuff. It leaves a bit of a weakness here. This pawn is a target. The knight's pointing on this pawn, so the bishop sort of has to stick around. But the bishop isn't really a great piece at the moment anyway, so he'll have to do something with it later. h5, trying to just solidify the knight so that the pawn can't chase the knight away. Probably fair, but it does give away. Some of these dark squares get a little bit weaker. Bishop h3, okay, putting pressure on the knight and indirectly sort of attacking the e6 pawn. So a6, maybe a bit of a waiting move, or just trying to stop the knight from coming into b5 potentially with this a6 move. Now knight comes into e5. Nice hole in the position. It's taken immediately, and Naka chooses to recapture with the e5 pawn, which might look a little bit strange at first because it gives black this protected pass pawn. But this move, of course, comes with tempo on the bishop. It makes the bishop look like a terrible piece on this diagonal, and it frees up the d6 square, the d4 square for this knight. And we see Naka quickly will bring this knight into d4, which is a great blockading square where it puts pressure on this weakness. So, yeah, bishop to e7. This move was probably forced because, first of all, the bishop doesn't want to hang around on this side where it's just biting on these pawns, and also the bishop here is putting pressure on the pawn on b6. So yeah, the knight comes into e2 where it's going to make a nice hop to d4. a5, the idea of this move is to get the bishop on a6 because here, of course, it's no longer doing anything. So we want to just bring the bishop into a diagonal where at least it has some scope. It's not really attacking anything at the moment, but who knows in the future. Okay, rook to the open file. Bishop comes out. This move is threatening. Yeah, the bishop here skewering, so Naka just takes a minute to block that. But it also does leave this pawn undefended, so Naka exploits that pretty quickly here, just chopping this knight and then takes the pawn. So just a pawn up here for Nakamura, and I don't think there's that much compensation for white. He tries to get some stuff going here with queen attacks, but the bishop just comes back. It's nicely defending this pawn. It's blockading the pass pawn, and I don't really see anything great going on here on the light squares for white. So he played bishop to d4, and after bishop to f1, this was pretty much the end of the game here because black, possibly in time trouble, committed a big blunder here. He played queen to b6, which loses immediately to rook takes c5. And now if rook takes c5, which was played, the tactic bishop takes a6, and if queen takes a6, then bishop takes the rook, and now black is simply up a piece. So there's no way to get out of this this stuff here. So rather than queen b6, black had to play bishop takes check, and just sort of try to hold this position a pawn down. Of course, white is still a pawn up, but I don't know. Is white a pawn up? Yeah, he's a pawn up, and just sort of hold on to this position. But I guess possibly in time trouble, white just missed that this tactic. You see the bishop come here. You want to move the queen, and he thinks, okay, now I've got everything defended, but he just missed rook takes. So all right, that's how the first game ended, and so let's move on to round 2. Okay, round 2 of the World Blitz Championship for Nakamura. He had the black pieces, and he was playing Wang Hao, strong Chinese grandmaster. At the moment, rated a little bit lower than he has been in the past. I think he's been up to 2760 or whatever, but he's hanging around 2730 right now. Naka has a pretty good score against him in classical chess. But let's see what happened in this Blitz game. So Wang Hao kicked off with d4, and we got a King's Indian defense. Black castles here. I think usually you play e5 first. Oh no, you castle first, of course, and then play e5. So he decides to go for this this h3 line, and just get this the big pawn structure here, the typical closed center King's Indian pawn structure. And Naka decides to go for a5. This is so that he can play knight to a6, c5, and the a pawn, of course. This is a very, very typical theme in the King's Indian, just to get the knight into c5. Bishop e3, knight a6, and now g4. So white is going for some aggressive pawn pushing here against the king, and sort of reversing the usual themes of the King's Indian here, where black usually pushes on the king side and tries to attack, and white goes for queenside stuff. In this game, Wang Hao is going for some aggressive kingside stuff here. Knight b d7, knight f6 d7, just trying to get into the c5 square and getting out of any of this g5 stuff with tempo. So h4, Wang Hao's going for it, leaving his king in the center. Knight comes into c5, where, of course, if it's taken by the bishop, it'll just be retaken by the knight, probably. And but here, Naka decides to get this knight here into b4. So looking for some queenside stuff, putting some pressure on the light squares in this position. And Wang Hao decides to chop the knight and sort of split the pawn formation here, or give black these double pawns. So let's see what happens here. a3, chasing the knight back, no other square. Bishop d3, queen f6, and now g4, looking to clamp down on the king side, and then h5 at some point. G5 and then h5 will probably come in. Queen f6, queen f3, just getting some pieces in. White is okay leaving the king in the center just to try to, the center is closed, so he's not in a hurry to castle. After f6, queen g5, and now c6, trying to strike at the center as well as strike at the king side. So how does the structure change here? Knight f3, knight comes back, now finally castles, and he's looking to get the knight here. The knight is going on this little journey to d6, where it's got a nice blockading point, and it's also putting pressure on these white pawns. So the knight comes into d6. King safety move for Wang, just getting the king out of the way. Bishop d7. Finally, Naka completes his development, and now Wang Hao decides to go for h5, trying to open lines against the king. And Naka goes for this stuff here, where now he plays h6 and g5, just trying to keep lines closed on the king side. And I thought I think that's kind of neat. There's no king side stuff going on here, and he's got nice control of the f5 square, but the light squares can become a little bit weak, so that's the downside. So let's see what happens now. Knight comes back. possibly looking to come into g4 here. But also the idea is to play this bishop here and exchange this terrible bishop for this nice bishop that black has, which is guarding these weakened light squares. And this bishop is really doing nothing. So this is a good positional idea, trying to get these bishops exchanged. But it does leave the c pawn now undefended, which Naka decides to grab. So he grabs the c pawn, and in this position, Naka is a pawn up, but maybe this pawn on c6, c5 here is a little bit weak. So if you give this position to the engines, actually, they sort of prefer white's position here. I don't know. It looks like a mess to me. I really don't know who's better in this position. So knight comes back, putting pressure on the e pawn, and he just decides to defend it with the f pawn. Now trying to get some play against the f3 pawn, and he's not concerned, just defends it. Now Naka decides to actually push the c pawn. I'm not sure really what the point of this was, but now, okay, the queen is looking at some of these light squares, and one potential idea in the position could be to bring the queen in here, check, and if queen takes, pawn takes, at some point, if the pawn was no longer on c6, that would be a really nice square. The d5 square would be a really nice square for the white knights to come into. So Naka just tries to prevent this queen e6 stuff, but then knight g4. Okay, the queen still can't come in. And now, yeah, see, this idea could come in at some point. Queen e6, where if takes, then the d5 square opens up for the white knights. So he just spends a tempo trying to slow down some queenside pawn pushes by black. Now Naka offers a queen trade, which Wang Hao obliges. And still, I think the computers will say white's a little bit better here. But it looks, for a blitz game, it looks difficult. The d4 square is weak, the f3 pawn is weak, the h pawn is weak. I would rather play black here. I think it's just easier for black to play. But I think technically the engines think white has a slightly better position. So knight b5 takes, and adding another pawn weakness here. And okay, the rook coming into f4, possibly with an idea maybe at some point to try to wrangle this pawn up. But actually, after the knight now recaptures the pawn, so the pawns are equal, black decides to go for this move g4, with the idea now that after g takes, the rook takes the e pawn, and you're giving you've got this pawn now becomes mobile. It's a pass pawn, and if it ever moves off of the e5 square, this bishop opens up and becomes a playable piece. So that's an interesting idea, and probably a good idea. So now knight to b6, and there's some counterplay though here. Okay, white has this nice pawn, which could become very dangerous very shortly, and actually does become very dangerous. Naka played rook to d8, rook to d6. Blockading was probably possible, but then probably just knight to c8, and then if the rook moves around, there could be some draw, just back and forth, d6 to d8. So he just b6 to c8. So he just decides to move the rook back, and now, okay, the pawn comes forward. So let's see what happens here. Rook d4, trying to put pressure on the pawn and offer a rook exchange. Just moves the pawn one more square forward, and now Naka decides finally to get that bishop into play with e4, opening up the bishop against this weak pawn on b2. Rook e4 and rook e1 and rook to b4. So now attacking these weakened pawns. King h1, rook check, and now actually Naka here commits a serious blunder according to the engines, but it wasn't taken advantage of in the game. The game went rook takes b2, attacking the knight. Knight moves back, and now rook collects the passed pawn, and now after rook check and rook b4 attacking the knight, which is pinned to the rook, rook check, king moves, rook here, and now taking advantage of the pin, black is just going down a piece, and he actually resigned here, but there could have been, it gets sort of dangerous. You can just see he's sort of losing a piece here. But actually, did he resign here? What happened to my? No, he played a few more moves. I thought he did. So trying to put the pin on the bishop there, but after check and takes the piece, then he resigned. Note that after this check, if the king moves here, then we get this move with a discovered check and taking the rook, and that's just disastrous. Yeah. So king b1, this stuff here, and note that if white tries to double up here and get some counterplay, this is checkmate immediately, but also white can just probably take here and just be okay. Just a piece up with these pawns will just quickly roll down the board. So yeah, so he resigned, but actually the computer suggests here that after rook takes b5, white had rook takes e4, and it's just winning. I mean, it's just flat out winning. There's no way for black to defend this threat of rook to e8 check. Just picking up the rook here and then queening pretty soon after that. So maybe Wang Hao was in time trouble or something and just missed this move. That's one of the things that Naka does when he plays Blitz, is he plays quickly and tries to get his opponent into time trouble. He may even play inferior moves just to try to create problems and get his opponent down on time. So Wang Hao missed an opportunity there, and Naka collects the point. So 2 wins in a row, and let's move on to round 3, and we'll see what happened there. Okay, time for game 3. So Naka has 2 points at this point in the standings. Round 3, he is playing Boris Savchenko, rated 2581. Naka's got the white pieces. So this game was a bit of a mess. This was a wild and crazy game. It was a long game, and I'm not going to go too deep into variations again. But Naka opened with e4, e6, so we're getting a potential French defense. Naka now goes with 2 queen e2. Doing his thing where he's playing somebody lower rated and he's just gonna try to get a funky position and outplay him. Voiding theory. This is his very, very standard MO in Blitz. So okay, so we've got sort of a French position that developed anyway with the queen on e2, sort of blocking the bishop in. So I'm not sure this is particularly great for white, but he gets e5, so sort of like an advanced French position. But now the knight comes into e4 because there's no knight on c3 or d2 developed yet, so he can get in on this e4 square. And now decides to solidify that knight with f5, or in the case of ef en passant, get the knight back. So we have sort of a typical French thing here going on where black has gotten in his like f6, f5 sort of break, and we'll be looking to play e5 as soon as possible to dissolve this weakness, but white gets the e5 square whole. So sort of a French type of position. But now after g3, he's got to do something about the bishop because the queen's blocking him in. We'll just get a couple moves going in here. The knight comes into e5 immediately, and now it's reinforced with f4. So looking for a big space advantage is Nakamura, and he gets it. So now he's got this 4-3 majority on the king side, which could be a source of play for him in the future. Bishop c5, preventing any castling on the king side. And Naka decides just to challenge that bishop right away because his dark square bishop isn't very good, and this is a very active piece for black, so logical. Okay, putting the bishop on h3 to sort of fight for the f5 square. Knight comes into f5, and he just decides to chop that knight right away and castle queenside. So battle lines have been drawn. Of course, the 4-3 pawn majority here on the king side is going to be try to be pushed down the board and try to get some checkmates going, and black will try to get some checks and some attack going on the queen side of white. So how does the position develop here? Queen e7, king safety move, bishop comes out. Note that black does have the bishop pair, so it's hard to say who's better in this position. White has a space advantage, but the two bishops, maybe even black could be preferred here in this position. But there's chances for both sides, I think. So centralizing, and now Naka goes for this interesting move c4, which is a pawn sack. And I'm not exactly sure what the idea, if this sort of thing was necessary. After this, black can just play b5 and hang on to that pawn. And now has 4 pawns that he can sort of push against I mean, he doesn't mind playing this b5 move. It does, sort of weaken some of these dark squares maybe, but I think he doesn't mind because he wants to get these pawns moving anyway. So the knight coming into d4, and queen coming back, looking to recapture. If Naka chooses to take that bishop, but he doesn't. He says, "Let's just go for it. Time to move. Time to get f5 in. Try to open some lines against the king." And now the bishop settles itself nicely into d5. I think this is a very nice square for the bishop because it looks like it's not doing anything right now, but it is blocking the d file. So there's not going to be really any penetration on the d file, and it is sort of eyeing these light squares against the king. And you can imagine the pawns coming down the board here, softening up some of these light squares. This could be a very potentially dangerous attacking piece. In fact, it's so dangerous that after b4 here, Naka decides after f5, b3. C3, B3, A5. Naka decides just to take that bishop because he's really getting some light square. Potentially, the queen can come in here at some point, and there could be sacrifices, and things could actually turn very dangerous. So he just decides he might as well just take that bishop and give himself some counter chances with this very strong pawn here, which is a pass pawn, and chances against the king. So the exchange down. What does Naka come up with? The queen comes into c5, trying to take advantage of some of these weakened dark squares. On with the pawn push by Savchenko. Knight d4. So okay, he's got these taking advantage of these weakened dark squares. Now the a file opens up. So let's see what happens. h6. Yeah, I don't know about. I mean, he's trying to prevent g5, but just h4 will get g5 in at some point anyway. So. Queen to f8, trying to exchange queens. I think if the queens are traded, then black has a better chance in this position. But Naka says, nope, I'm just going to push my pawn forward. Nicely covered by the rook and by the queen. Could become a queen. And now a double attack on this pawn and the queening square. So black is forced to defend with the rook, and now the queen enters into the position here. It's dangerous because black is definitely white has definitely got the initiative because of this pawn and potential kingside stuff, which we see pretty soon after the king moves to h7. Naka just says fine, g5 and g6 check. So picking up a piece here. He's just after giving up the exchange, after winning the exchange and then giving back a rook, he's now just a piece down. But he's got a couple pawns for it. This position for Naka is actually much better. I think it's totally indefensible for black, but he manages somehow to put up some resistance as things go. I mean, the king looks a little bit open, so maybe he can try to get some things in here. Naka just says, let's get the queens off, and this pawn here is a game winner for me, plus the extra piece. So moving out of the way, king trying to round up the pawn, but the knight finds a very nice square on c6, protecting the pawn. So the rook is going to have trouble getting active in this game. So now, okay, black has some pawns too. He's just going to try to push it. Knight grabs the pawn on c6. The idea, of course, is that if the rook takes the pawn here, then knight comes in here with check, picking up the piece. So the pawn is safe for now. Now the king just coming in to stop these two passed pawns, and knight comes back. So okay, what's going on here? The king is coming in, munching the pawns. He's unconcerned, but now okay, the pawn is on f2 or g2. Could be some potential counterplay here, and yeah, now he goes for it. The counterplay, so he has to stop the pawn from moving in, and now we get a long sort of endgame here, where black gets in a lot of checks, and white is just slowly trying to make progress here, pushing the pawns, protecting the knight, moving the king in, moving the rook around. And this is an interesting moment in the game. Black plays king f7. You might think to yourself, what happens here on queen? Then we have this position where the rook comes into d8, king moves here, and now we queen with check. And this is going to be mating very soon. And it would be kind of cool to see this position. Would have been cool to see this position on the board, where both kings look like they're very quickly in danger of being mated, but white gets there just a little bit sooner. So he actually played king f7, and now threatening to queen with check. So he tries these checks here. The idea being that if the king takes the rook, then black queens with check. So just trying to avoid this stuff. Maybe picking up some seconds on the clock here is Nakamura. Now going for this check, and actually the computer here says this position is like even or something. Like somewhere along the way here, Naka messed up, and I'm not going to go into it. Here now after queen, now he takes the rook and queens with check, and this actually is sort of a drawn position according to the computer, because black gets in all these kinds of checks here, and white has to be careful not to drop the rook. Like that, he drops the rook, and now maybe he decided here to play the knight move, because he gets the knight with check and then picks up the b7 pawn. But I'm not sure if queening was maybe just a draw with perpetual checks here. So he went for this, and actually in this position, black's flag fell, and Naka gets the win. Objectively, I have no idea what's going on here in this position, because it looks like black can get in a lot of checks, and even if I think there might even be chances for a draw, even if white somehow manages to get this pawn here and queen. If black could just check around and try to exchange queens at some point, then white would be left with king and two knights versus the king, which is not enough material to mate. So so yeah, this is a strange game, a kind of a fun game. Somewhere like back here, around here, if you give this position to the computer, it's just saying, plus 20 for white. Like, this is clearly a winning position for white. And then somewhere through here, Nakamura messed things up, and it's tough to analyze. But around here, the computer's saying this is just a draw. And okay, Naka played on time a bit and got to this very interesting position. And I'm not sure. I really don't know what's going on here. But all right, a fun game, and that was the third round. And so at this point, Nakamura has 3 out of 3. So all right, let's move on to game 4. All right, game 4, Nakamura. So in this game, he was playing black versus Radoslav Vortacek, very strong Polish GM, 27-15. And frequent second of Vishy Anand for a lot of the World Championship matches. So Naka had black in this game, so let's see what happened. Vortacek opened with d4, d5, and we get the Queen's Gambit accepted, where white plays the quick e4, and black decides to try to hang on to the pawn with this stuff. And interestingly here, after I don't know if this is theory or not, but white can take this pawn on b5, because if the pawn takes the knight, then the rook on a8 is hanging, and Naka decides to go for it anyway. I guess at this point there's no other option if you're going to play this b5 line. Yeah, he just decides to give up the exchange very early in the game in exchange for some quick development and a pawn, an extra pawn here. So he's down the exchange, but maybe gets some slightly quicker development. Not really, but I don't know. I don't think there's that much compensation for black here in this position. I really should look into the theory, but I don't know. Now just giving the pawn back, but the d4 pawn is a little bit weak, so that could be a target. And now after knight to g5, he does decide to take the pawn, and we get some exchanges here. Now white has the two bishops and an exchange for a pawn, but the pawns are both on the same side of the board, and it could be a little bit difficult to make something happen here. Why Naka would go for something like this is beyond me. I mean, there's no way anybody but white in this position has a chance to win. I mean, black is just playing essentially to try to hold a draw at this point. And I think this stems from the opening choices he made, but okay. That's sort of the way Nakamura plays. So the bishops are trying to cause some problems here. And he decides to give up one of these bishops now for the knight to sort of damage the pawn structure. Interesting decision, sort of guaranteeing that white can never really create a passed pawn because of the damaged pawn structure even though it's a 4-3. So white is playing with essentially no risk here, just going for it. So we get some stuff happening here, not a whole lot to speak of. Deciding to trade bishops here, and now the king moves out of the way or comes closer to the center. And I guess at this point, this was a key moment, sort of, where if white trades one pair of rooks, then the knight versus the rook with the extra pawn on one side of the board is just completely a draw, I would think. So he decides to hang on to a rook, and black just sort of goes around here, shuffling around, not really doing anything, just saying, okay, how are you going to break through in this position? And maybe it's really not possible to break through in this position, so we just sort of get some shuffling going on here, protecting the f7 pawn. And in a few moves here, the players agree to draw. So yeah, I mean, Wojtaszek didn't really want to push in this position. I don't know what the time situation on the clock was, so I think he was probably happy just to get a draw with Nakamura in Blitz. Naka's a very strong Blitz player, and this position sort of fizzled into nothing, and they agreed to a draw here. If you give it to the engines at this point, the engines say that white's better by a pawn and a half. But it's hard to make progress, and engines don't always have a clear, it sees the material, but it doesn't really know that there's no way to make progress. So maybe this position really is just a draw, but yeah, I'm not entirely sure. So kind of a strange game from Nakamura, if you ask me. Again, I don't really know the theory, and I didn't really go into any variations here because this video is going to be very long if I go into these variations. So yeah, interesting game, but I think Wojtaszek really could have pushed, but he decided not to. So a draw. So 3.5 out of 4 for the first 4 rounds from Nakamura. And let's move on to game 5. Okay, so moving along, we're on round 5 now, and this is featuring Nakamura white versus Lu Shangli of I think China, rated 25-46. So with the white pieces, Naka plays one knight f3 and b3. This is again sort of the stuff he likes to do. He loves to play this b3 bishop b2 sort of Larsen's opening stuff. He does that all the time online just because he figures he knows the positions and he can sort of outplay his lower rated opponent just over the board. No theory. So trying not to trade some pieces here, so going for this double fianchetto development, and black sort of employing like a reverse London system with this bishop on the outside of the pawn chain. Maybe c6 could be something. Looks very solid for black. Bishop d6, castles, knight bd7, and just moving the bishop out of the way, and now playing e5. So black looks fine in this position. Out of the opening, I don't think he has any problems. He's got this after e4. He could even maybe think about playing d4 here and just sort of playing with the space advantage. Closing up the center with d4 will leave probably the f4 break for white as a plan. So he decides here to go just for the exchange, and to my eyes this position looks pretty equal. Maybe you can argue that as long as this pawn here is well protected on e4, this bishop is really not doing much. Even if after like f3 or something. So maybe you could argue white is slightly better, but I don't think black has any particular problems in this position. So queen e7, and now probably trying to just stop any bishop to b4 stuff, pinning the knight. So he plays a3. Logical move, rook to the open file where it's against the queen e2. So just some stuff here, and now an interesting move here. White trying to take advantage of this bad bishop and the f5 square. The idea being if white tries to prevent this knight from coming into f5 with the move g6, this bishop just becomes a worthless piece essentially. So he gets his knight into this f5 square with tempo. And it's hard, of course, to ever play the move g6 simply because, well, of course, this bishop is stupid, and it, of course, would hang the h6 pawn with check. So maybe white's got a little bit of pull here in this position. In fact, after queen e6, bishop to e3, pretty soon, the queen moves out of the way here, potentially putting pressure on the c2 pawn. But pretty soon, black just decides that he can't tolerate this knight on f5 anymore, and he just takes it. And after an interesting decision here to recapture with the pawn, just trying to keep some space on the king side, maybe get the e4 square for this knight, and allow this bishop to come in here on this diagonal. Interesting positional move. So the bishop comes back, it was under attack, and now c4, picking up some space. So now I think the position is looking better for white, definitely. He's got more space, and black doesn't really have any targets. White has this target here on e5, and so black tries to defend it, and now the bishop comes back to this long diagonal, and black's definitely got some more space, and now white has this weak pawn here that's a bit of a target, and he decides it's time to go after it. And in fact, after this series of moves here, he does pick up the d4 pawn. So white is a pawn up now, and this bishop is just an awesome piece on this diagonal, and black's pieces are all sort of not coordinated very much here. So and it's really cool and instructive the way Naka converts this position. He plays after rook to b8, he defends the pawn, moves the rook to the open d file, and plays c6. So what he's doing with this move is marking out the d7 square. So the knight is going to go on this little jump here into d7, where it's going to be nicely placed. And if, like in the game, we get just a couple more moves here, and we get this move knight to d7, where the rook is attacked, the knight is attacked, this knight is attacked. So this knight can't really be tolerated, but it's really hard to find a way for white to capture this knight where he's not giving something up. And he decides to take the knight, but now this pawn on d7 is just a monster, and it's really lost at this point for black. I mean, there's really nothing for black left to do in this position. The bishop comes in to defend the pawn. The rook attacks the bishop, but now this nice maneuver just to finish the game, queen a6 to a8, and the game is over here. There's no way for black to defend the pawn queening. So he played that move, and after taking the piece, I just resigned, because he's a piece down for nothing in this position, and there's no way to to really do anything in this position, so he just decided to resign. So a really cool, instructive positional sort of crush for Nakamura here, just landing this knight on f5. Very instructive, capturing with the pawn, so the bishop can come to this diagonal. Very, very kind of cool, exploiting the two bishops here, finally getting rid of this bishop and exploiting this weak pawn. And in the end, deciding to mark out this d7 square and hop this knight on in to the d7 square and just use this pawn to sort of push the game home. Just one final thing here. Yeah, I mean, there's no way to stop the queening at this point, so it's just game over. So, all right, that was round 5. So now Naka is on 4.5 out of 5, and we will move on to the next round. Okay, round 6. We have Naka playing Laquang Liem, who's a young Vietnamese. Or is he Vietnamese? Yeah, I believe he's Vietnamese grandmaster, who's actually, up until this point, the defending World Blitz champion. He won the World Blitz Championship last year, and actually recently played on Chess.com. He played a death match versus Dmitry Andreikin, and really had a terrible day and got killed. But he's a very strong Blitz player, and he actually shows that in this game. So Naka with the black pieces. We saw d4, and we saw bishop to g5, the Trompovsky. So Laquang Liem giving Nakamura a little bit of his own medicine. Naka plays this a lot with white as on Blitz. So going for c5, d5, d6. So almost like a Benoni position here we get into with the bishop on b5. So we're getting into a Benoni type position here. He plays the bishop to b5 check. Knight comes back to defend a4. Yeah, so this is definitely very Benoni-ish position. And now he decides to play knight to a6 with the idea that the knight can come back here and potentially prepare a6, b5 stuff. Very, very sort of common in the Benoni. And here he decides to take the bishop and go for grabbing the two bishops and play for a5 right away. He's not threatening to take the pawn now because the rook is pinned, so Laquang Liem can just sort of stay put in this sort of position. Knight comes to b6, maybe eyeing the c4 square. So now after the captures and offering the bishop trade, we get sort of a, I don't know, like probably slightly better for white with the e5 move coming in soon and getting the e4 square for pieces to come into, queen e4, stuff like that. Typical, Benoni push in the center, but black may have some counterplay, on the b file in sort of Benoni Benko style. So e5 comes right away. If you look at this with a computer, it thinks that this move was a little early after bishop a6. But it doesn't think Naka played best here with e6, and this is the kind of move where it's tough for me to analyze. Like these types of pawn structures seem very difficult, but the grandmasters seem not to have much of a problem with it. And after sort of all this stuff shakes out, it seems that white has a bit of a better position because this is now a very strong passed pawn on d6 there. So let's see what happens. He grabs the pawn on b2. Grabs a pawn on a6. So we have equal pawns here, right? Yeah, we have equal pawns here, but of course the pawn on b6 is very strong. And after takes, bishop to c5, this looks like a nice move where white is sort of forking two pieces, and it looks like he's going to win a piece, but there's a very nice response in this position where it's bishop f6. And the point being that if the bishop moves off of this diagonal and takes either one of these pieces, then the queen comes into h6, and then there's no stopping the checkmate here. So both of those pieces are immune from being taken. So he grabs the bishop, and this looks like sort of a difficult position for black to play. And here he actually commits the massive blunder of the game, Naka. The computer says the only move in this position to play on was rook to e8. threatening this to take this piece with check, and then maybe doing something with the bishop, and the computer gives white plus over equal, like half a pawn advantage for white. That was the only move to sort of stay in the game. He played bishop to b7, and this move turns out really to be a disaster, because once the rooks come off the board, the knight is coming in here to e5, and this pawn is just super dangerous. And in fact, there's really no way for him even to hang on to the pawn now, because after queen e7, or to hang on to the game, because this pawn is just running home. And actually here Naka resigned. This was the end of the game, because there's really no way to stop this pawn from coming through. So Naka's luck ran out a little bit here. He had some worse positions, some losing positions against Wang Hao, and he got lucky that Wang Hao didn't find the win, but Lukwang Liam finds the win here. So very interesting, Benoni type of position. I think that the key moments in the game here came after this e5 move, and Naka decided to go with this e6 stuff here, where we get this pawn structure formation, where materials equal, but this pawn on d6 proves just to be too strong for Naka's position to deal with. And this tactic, of course, nicely met by bishop f6. And now after this stuff coming in here, the knight coming to e5, and the queen here and the pawn coming home, the game is just sort of over. So yeah, interesting game, and a nice win for Lukwang Liam. It probably felt good to get a win versus Naka. So this was round 6, and Naka lost the game, so he has 4.5 out of 6 now, going into the next game in this position, in this tournament. So, all right, we'll move on to round 7 now. Okay, so round 7. Featured Naka playing Judith Polgar. Judith, of course, needs no introduction. So let's see what happened here. Well, Naka had the white pieces, and now in the following round he played himself. He played the Trumpovsky here, and Judith goes for this knight e4 stuff. I think this is theory. I think this is the most aggressive way to play against the Trump, and that would be expected. Judith's a very aggressive player, but pretty quickly this position sort of deteriorates for her. After d6, getting a very strong pawn here on d6, with the bishop and the queen guarding the pawn, it's tough for black to actually develop this bishop unless he fianchettos it. So Judith went for this move g5, which seems to be sort of bad position for her, sort of a blunder. This game was sort of an opening disaster, and she tried her best to get into some kind of counterplay here, but after bishop e5 she played f6, and now queen to h5 check. The position becomes very difficult, and now the queen coming into f7, now taking on f6, forking the two pieces here. So this is already pretty bad for black. So she just decides to sort of go for some counterplay here with the knight check, the queen check, and the queen coming in here on f1 check. But the knight just blocks, and what's going on here? The queen's coming in. She's trying to get some perpetual checks, but Naka just calmly says, "I'm going to move this back, and I'll pick up this rook, in the corner later." The rook hasn't got any squares to go to. So he first attacks the queen with b3. The queen comes in here, and now just, okay, I'm going to munch this rook now, and I'm a whole rook up, and what's your compensation here? Tries to develop the bishop, and now he actually plays a very interesting move here, knight to c3, which looks like it's just uncovering. The queen can just take the rook. But things would get interesting if the queen takes the rook, and the knight comes in here to e5 with check, and if the bishop takes, then the bishop is cutting the king off from running, and this sort of stuff is very dangerous. Could be very dangerous for for white, and the queen is maybe a little bit out of play here. So materially it's equal, but white has got the initiative in this type of position here. So rather than take the rook, she just sort of takes the pawn and goes for this exchange here. But in this position, she's really just down a rook for not much compensation, slightly better development. And Naka gets his bishop out of the way, and the king, he has to untangle himself a little bit, but really it's just a rook. I mean, there's no real compensation here, and now this nice tactic here, check, and if the bishop takes, then this bishop is hanging, so winning another pawn, and yeah, I mean, there's really nothing to do. It's just technique at this point. Trading more pieces is fine. Moving the pawn, getting the rook to the open file here, looking for penetration, and yeah, after king c4 and e4 check, king c2, Judith just resigned. The king is actually in a mating net here. Almost every square the king can go to is covered except for the c4 square. So what's black's move here? If he were to just make a move like this, rook to say this, then this rook comes in with check, and this rook check here, and this is just mate. So she resigned after this, probably just in disgust and frustration with how she played this game, because it was really just not good. It was really an opening disaster for Judith, more or less. So let's just take a quick look here. I mean, after this d6 move, things get pretty bad. There's just no real. It looks like you're getting some counterplay here, but it's just the queen, and white has enough defensive resources here. He's just up a rook here. Now just an exchange. Actually, no, it's still a rook. So it's just a matter of untangling here in this position, and picking up another pawn, and just I guess you just played it out, because what are you going to do? You could just resign immediately, or just play it out a little bit, hope for some miracle or something. But you're not going to beat Nakamura a rook down in a position like this. So yeah, a bit of a shame, a bit of an opening disaster for Judith, but Naka gets back in the win column. So now he has out of 7, he has 5.5 out of 7 up to this point in the tournament. So let's move on to game number 8. Okay, so round 8 here. This is Nakamura versus Jan Nepomniachtchi, the player who came in actually second in this tournament. So Naka was playing black in this position, and this was a kind of a fun game. So let's see what happened here. E4 from Nepomniachtchi, and Naka goes for the French defense, and we get the classical French. So black playing this. This is all theory here so far. White trying to. Black trying to attack the d4 pawn, and this move rook b8 is less played, but still a theoretical move. Interesting, just getting the rook and trying to prepare the b5 push pretty quickly. A6, b5, trying to pick up some space on the queen side. Meanwhile, white is trying to, and now actually white's going to probably try to play on the king side. And actually, Naka goes for sort of a blocking of the queen side here. Typical French defense, either f5 or f6. Nepomniachtchi decides to take, which gives Naka some space for his knight to come in, but of course it gives up the e5 square. So shortly we'll see a piece come into e5, c4. So picking up some space on the queen side, giving up pressure on the d pawn, but just going to try to make something happen, on the queen side. Castles, bishop d6, knight e5, pretty standard. Knight d7. This is an interesting move. Of course, the knight was under attack here, and either had to take. Well, taking's not an option because pawn retakes, and then there's a fork. But probably something like bishop d7 or something. Would just leave the bishop sitting here on e6 if he takes, and it's not really doing anything. So he just decides, I'll move the knight and I'll keep control of the f5 square. Maybe sink the knight into f5, try to slow down the f5 break by white. It seems like a good positional decision, but white's like, okay, let's go for it. I've got, the center is pretty closed up, got good control in the center, time to make a move on the king side. g4. Naka says, I don't care. Come at me with g4. Come at me, brah. So, yeah, c3. This is an interesting decision. I'm not sure what the idea of this move was, this c3 move, because I think it gives black a chance to break sooner with the b pawn, which he does right away. And bishops. I guess this was the long-term idea of the c3 move, was to reroute the bishop to c2 and get it on this nice diagonal. But again, he gave Nakamura a chance here with this move. But actually here, white Naka, after playing queen e8, missed this rook d1, a5. I guess I was thinking this move came sooner, but queen here. Yeah, so he's moving the pieces on he's moving the stuff on the queen side, trying to get some play here. And this was an interesting idea. b4. The idea being that if white takes, which he doesn't recapture the b pawn. He takes on c3, and the idea is now he has these pawns here, which could become dangerous pass pawns, and actually they do end up becoming dangerous. And now after knight h5, this was actually sort of a blunder because he missed this tactic. That after bishop takes h7, king takes h7, white has g6 check, blocking the queen's defense of the knight, and allowing this queen to come in here and capture the piece back. And now sort of he's got some dangerous checkmating threats and stuff here. So Naka sort of had to scramble. It's not over yet, but he did have to scramble. Gives himself a little bit of room here with rook to f4, rook to f5, giving the king the flight square, and then if the queen comes in here, then the knight comes back to check, which we see does happen. Well, actually, he just moves the knight back there, so just had enough to defend this position for the moment. It's still a little bit better for white, of course, because he's up a pawn, but Naka does get some dangerous counterplay going with these pass pawns, so let's see how it happens. He just decides, hey, let's move these pawns out of the way. And of course, when this pawn moves out of the way, it does open this bishop up on the diagonal to the rook. So the knight comes into d3, e3, and Naka says, okay, you take my exchange, and I'll take this back. And I'm still, attacking this rook here, and there's nowhere for it to go. So he had time. He had the move to take the knight back, and so white decides to attack the queen with the rook, but just moves the queen out of the way and defends the bishop here. And after this capture here, maybe he could even have retaken with the queen immediately, but there's no need to even take the knight back. He even has this Wijnzug rook b8, and now we see that these pawns are coming in handy for black, because now white is forced to play this bishop back, defending the queening square. And after this takes move here, this is a very, very tough position for white. And in fact, it's losing now, because after rook takes check, rook takes, and queen e6, the bishop is pinned to the king. It's threatening to queen, and if the king steps out of the pin, which it does, then black can just sacrifice the queen, and queen here with check, and this was the end of the game. So a real quick turnaround for Nakamura in this game. Just I guess Nepomniachtchi really underestimated the power of those passed pawns there at the end of the board. After he had this bishop takes h7 check stuff, and this is a better position for white, but somehow Naka managed to hold on with some only defensive moves here and get some counterplay. And yeah, I mean, this all seems sort of dangerous. White's king looks bad, but the knight is doing a really good job of just preventing anything from coming through here. And now he has a chance to get the b file and the pass pawn counterplay, and it turns out just to be too much. This was the final blunder here. It's hard to suggest. It's hard to even suggest a move for black here. I'm not sure. Maybe he has to bring the queen back to h5 or something or h4 or something like that to try to hang on. But he certainly doesn't have time for this. He just missed this move here, and just down a piece here. And there's no way to stop this pawn from running home either. So this is just game over. So yeah, all right, Nakamura. That was round 7 or round 8? I guess that was round 8. So knock another win. So having a good showing so far, and managed to get the win. I don't know how the tiebreaker situation worked out, because it turned out in the end that Nepomniachtchi, the white player in this game, and Nakamura both had 16 out of 21. So they were both sort of tied for second, and Nepomniachtchi's tiebreaker must have been more. And I'm not sure what the first tiebreaker was, because it wasn't the result, I guess, in their head-to-head game, because Naka won that. So in any case, let's move on to the next round and see what happens. Okay, so round 9 here. We have Naka playing white versus Georg Meyer of Germany, who's FIDE rated 2632, but is a very excellent blitz player. And in fact, after the first day, I think he was in 2nd or 3rd place in this very strong blitz tournament. So an interesting battle coming up here. Naka versus Meyer. So Naka with white opened with knight f3, and he went for sort of a Reti sort of setup here, King's Indian attack-ish, and Meyer played for very solid pawn structure with the bishop outside the pawn chain. So very solid looking for black. And so Naka is sort of trying to get this Reti English sort of setup. Again, employing that sort of strategy where he's not looking for a huge advantage or anything out of white. He just wants to sort of get out of theory early and just play a chess game. And this position looks relatively equal to me. So just developing some pieces here, putting the queen on c2. Now actually, to my eyes, black looks like he has a little bit of an advantage here with the better position in the center. But let's see what happens. a3, just stopping any of this, and also maybe trying to prevent some a4 stuff. So rook to e1 and c5. It's an interesting move. The idea being that if either the bishop or the knight takes on c5, then the e5 pawn will be hanging because of the dual pressure here. So Georg is not interested in that exchange, so he just backs the bishop up and defends his e5 pawn. And now Naka strikes in the center with e4, d4. So we have some kind of some pawn structure formations going on here. b4, takes, and now c4. And Georg is trying to sort of block the queen side up and say, let's see if you can come out and get me here. This pawn structure formation, to my eyes, now seems to favor, maybe it's equal. It's probably dynamically equal. And after this, Naka decides to take on Passant and just sort of get some of these squares open for some of his pieces to potentially come in through. Just seems like a logical decision, just trying to get some, even if it's not maybe objectively the best, it's just trying to get some play in the position here. So the knight comes into c4, and this bishop comes out here, protecting the b4 pawn. And we're going to see this other knight jump into c5 at some point. Just moving the king out of the way, maybe black's preparing to double here, and Naka decides to move on the king side with f4, logical, attacking the the weak pawn, and then you always want to attack, as the Nimzowitsch says, the base of the pawn chain. So Meyer decides, okay, I'll just defend the base of the pawn chain. Logical. Okay, moving the bishop out of the way, sacrificing a pawn, which Meyer takes, but there's also some counterplay potential here now with the bishop on the open diagonal, and the rook coming here against the queen. And now after capturing and capturing, and then taking the knight, Naka gets his pawn back with the nice tactic. Knight takes d4. The idea is it's discovering an attack on the queen, and if the queen recaptures, then the knight recaptures. So he gets his pawn back, but black has the two bishops, and there's a target here on d3, and this white bishop isn't really doing anything. So if you ask me, black is just better in this position for not much for white. But he decides immediately to give up the light square bishop, just hoping to place more pawns on the light squares and make this bishop an even worse piece, and sort of tie the bishop down to defending this pawn. And we just, we get some moves here, not a whole lot going on. The pawn structure is symmetrical, and now with opposite color bishops, this position looks pretty much dead to me. The knight coming into d4, and this knight on d3 now, but will eventually work its way to the d5 square. We just get some pieces moving around, the knight coming into d5, and here with the symmetrical pawn structure, symmetrical knight positions, and the opposite color bishops, this position basically fizzled out to a draw. I mean, there's nothing really going on here. There we get some shuffling around, and now it's a bishop versus knight, and the knight on d4 is really nice, and just some moving around here, not a whole lot going on, and pawns exchanged, and eventually, pretty soon here, they agreed to a draw. Just some more moving around. Maybe Naka was playing on time a bit, but after this move here, the two players agreed to a draw. I mean, yeah, the position's just dead. The knight can never. You can just move the knight around, and it can just plant itself on d4. And the king is always can never be chased off of this square because of the light square. The nature, it's a light square bishop, and so black can just move his knight around, hopping around the d4 square and back to the d4 square forever, and there's no way for white to make any progress, and also there's no real way for black to make any progress. So a fair result. They agree to draw. An interesting game. Yeah, I think both sides had some interesting chances here, but it's sort of after this this stuff here, this sort of fizzled out into a draw. I think maybe if Meyer really wanted to hang on and play for a win, he should have found a way to hang on to this light square bishop. But playing Nakamura and having a good result so far, I guess he was content with just sort of playing for the draw here. And so, all right, that was round 9, and we'll finish up with round 10. Yeah, I'm sorry if I'm going through these games kind of quickly, but this video is already over an hour, and there's 21 rounds, and I'll have to make it into a two-parter, so I don't want to spend forever on any of these games and make it a 4-hour video. So, all right, we'll move on to round 10, and that will be the last one for today, and we'll do part 2 with the final rounds tomorrow. Okay, so the last round for the day that we'll see today, and probably the most anticipated matchup of the Blitz tournament, featuring Hikaru Nakamura playing Magnus Carlsen. Number 1 had just the day before won the Rapid Championship, is of course the classical champion, and looking for a Blitz Championship, which he ended up winning. So Magnus, of course, holding all 3 time control championships at the moment, and Naka was the number 1 rated Blitz player going into the tournament. So this was, of course, a very anticipated matchup. So let's see what happens here. Naka's playing black, so we get e4, e5, and Naka not playing some random stuff versus Magnus. We get the Scotch game with Magnus choosing to play knight to b3. I think the more common move here is bishop to e3, and then black plays bishop b6 because white is threatening to take the knight, and yeah, after so he just decides to play knight b3, and Magnus also does this sort of thing where he doesn't tend to play strange or unusual openings like Nakamura does, but he tends to pick lines in openings where White's not really playing for much advantage, but he just decides he's going to outplay people in the middle game, and he does that in classical chess too, very successfully. So pieces just coming out, we're getting developed here, and now there's actually some pressure on this knight, which is pinned, and Naka decides to attack the queen and try to sort of defend it with the bishop. So castles, and now Naka goes for this move, bishop takes h3, and Magnus is forced to retake with the pawn, I believe, because if queen takes, then there's this move knight forking, winning a pawn, and if this comes in, then this is just obviously much better for black, just a pawn up and a terrible structure here. So that variation is just much better for black. So after this, Magnus is forced to take with the pawn, giving himself some weaknesses on the king side, but still maintaining this pressure here and potentially giving black some weaknesses on his king side, which in a moment he does, deciding to trade off here. So now we sort of have a position with the same color bishops, and both sides have weaknesses around their kings to try to exploit, and White has a little bit of space, so maybe a slight edge for White here at the moment, but probably it's not much. But that's what Magnus is good at, taking not much slight advantage and trying to turn it into something. So Naka tries to dissolve a weakness immediately, and Magnus decides to attack the b7 pawn. So Naka gets rid of one of his weaknesses. Still, these pawns on the king side are split, so those are attackable, but at least he got rid of one, and it's still double pawns here for White. So we get some exchanges here, and now the king comes over just to stop the rook from coming in. So lead in development for White still a little bit, but that's quickly becoming a non-factor. And Magnus pushing a little bit, trying maybe to harass this bishop, but Naka says, "Yeah, I'll just get this out of the way," and decides to put the rook on d8 instead of the open file, probably because there's no penetration points on this file. So he says, maybe I'll make something happen on the d file with the rook. Now getting the king out of the pin here, because Magnus is threatening, of course, to take. The pawn is pinned to the king, so just getting out of that stuff, and just staying tight, maybe moving his majority a little bit here. It's hard to say who's better. I think maybe if anybody's better now, it's actually black, but not a whole lot going on here. So bringing the rook in, trying to exchange rooks, but Magnus isn't ready for that quite yet. Now the idea is if the rooks are exchanged, yeah, maybe this pawn here is a weakness. So Naka doesn't want to do that. He just defends the pawn, backs the bishop up. Still not a whole lot going on here. Now Naka offering a draw with the repetition, but Magnus says, "Yeah, let me try to make something happen here." But there's really not a whole lot going on. Now Naka trying to push this majority, trying to create some counterplay on the queen side. Now going into the rook endgame, and probably a computer says this is equal. Maybe I don't know. Hard to say who's better in this position, but he's getting the h pawn now. Oops. He's getting this h pawn, which could be dangerous. So Naka has to be slightly careful here with his play, but trying to get his own pawns moving. Now, now this could be dangerous with the pawn coming down here. So Naka quickly tries to get the king over to stop the pawn. So maybe White has a bit of an advantage here. I mean, this is probably still a draw. If you check with the computer, and pretty soon we get a position where more pawns are being exchanged, and when we get to this position here, the players agreed a draw. This is a book draw technically because each side has one pawn that's pretty easily attacked and defended. So it would be tough even for Magnus to win this position in a blitz game. So once these pawns come off the board, then it's just rook versus rook. So Naka and Magnus got a draw, and that's a fair result. Probably Naka's not unhappy about this result. Playing Magnus Carlsen. So a nice start to the tournament for Nakamura. He had one loss versus who was it? Oh, Laquang Liam in that King's Indian game. And other than that, a lot of wins and some draws, a couple draws. So tomorrow we will look at part 2 of how Naka played in the World Blitz Championship. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this game, and we will see you next time.